So last night, the 7th of February, 2025, Pastor Chris, in your Love Word Specials, discussed the timing of the rapture. This is amazing. You have to watch, you have to listen to this, you have to watch this. This is a sign that he was given by Jesus in 2020. And he's just released it now because the sign he was given came true. Basically, I'll give you a big clue. It's around the word Trump. Let's listen to an excerpt.
All the time, as we were journeying from 2020 into 2021, 2022, 2023, I held this thing in my heart, waiting to see how what God said to me was going to pass.
Let's listen to this deep dive.
Welcome back, listeners. Today we're taking a deep dive into something a bit different. It's a prophetic interpretation, and, it's causing a bit of a stir online. We're talking biblical verses, current events, and a whole lot of, let's just say, outside-the-box thinking.
Yeah, definitely grabs your attention, doesn't it?
For sure. We're looking at a sermon, actually, delivered by a pastor who is making some, pretty bold claims about Donald Trump's second presidency.
And how it all ties into the biblical rapture.
Exactly. He's basically laid out this prophetic countdown, and the clock is ticking. What's really got me hooked is how he's connecting specific scripture verses to U.S. presidential history. Definitely not your average Sunday sermon.
Not at all. The thing that first caught my eye, it's the way this pastor interprets the phrase last Trump from 1 Corinthians.
1 Corinthians 15.52, right?
That's the one. Most folks wouldn't automatically jump to a political figure with that, but he's made a very direct link to Donald Trump.
Yeah, it's a bold move. And the way he explains it is actually pretty interesting. He points out that Trump was the 45th president.
Right, and then Biden came in as the 46th.
So if Trump wins again, he'd be number 47, making him the second Trump. It's like a biblical equation or something.
And to add to the mystery of it all, this pastor claims that God revealed this to him back in 2020.
Before Trump even announced he was running again.
Exactly. He's suggesting there's a divine timeline unfolding here.
It really makes you think about the role of, personal revelation when it comes to these kinds of prophecies. But the second Trump idea is just the beginning. He then goes on to connect this to the concept of two distinct trumpet sounds in the Bible.
Each one signaling a different event related to the rapture.
Like a soundtrack. He even uses this really vivid word, harpazo, from the Greek, which means to be snatched, to describe how sudden and unexpected it'll be.
It definitely paints a very striking picture.
Totally. And he takes it even further, talking about 5 total raptures throughout history, starting with Christ's ascension and then the resurrection of certain saints. There's even a verse about it, Matthew 27.52. It's a much bigger view of the rapture than a lot of people might realize.
Yeah, it's not just a single event, but this series of events playing out across time.
And he sees the second flight, the rapture of living believers, as the next one to happen. And of course, this is where he ties it all back to the second Trump presidency.
Right. He calls it the main event, suggesting that those who are taken up in this specific rapture are the ones who will experience, the fullness of God's glory, and they'll be spared from the tribulations that are coming.
So are you saying the other raptures are, less desirable?
He doesn't come right out and say that, but he definitely implies that the experiences of those involved in those other raptures might not be as, glorious or as immediate.
Wow. So the timing of the rapture really matters in his view.
It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. And that's where this sense of urgency in his message really comes through. He's pushing his congregation to be prepared for this second flight because he believes it's happening soon. And it's all tied to this very specific timeline, potentially triggered by a second Trump presidency.
It's wild how he brings current events into his biblical interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
But he doesn't stop there. He's got some strong opinions about how worship is done these days, too.
Right. He's a traditionalist, for sure. And he takes issue with what he sees as too much focus on entertainment and self-promotion in modern worship. He's especially critical of those traveling ministers of worship who charge for their services.
Yeah, he seems to think they're more interested in making money than actual genuine praise and worship.
He contrasts that with what he sees as true worship, the kind that's centered solely on God and happens in the house of God.
No outside influences. It's a pretty distinct contrast.
He's definitely advocating for a return to what he considers the purest form of worship, the kind rooted in tradition.
I think it's interesting how this critique of modern worship ties into his whole message about being ready for the rapture. It's like he's saying the folks who've embraced these new ways of worshiping are going astray.
Yeah, adds another layer of complexity to his whole prophecy, right? It's not just about a future event. It's about what's going on in the church right now.
A call for spiritual revival. Lots to unpack here. But before we dive deeper into all that, what jumps out at you about this pastor's interpretation?
Well, it's this mix of biblical interpretation, modern events, and social commentary, all in one. Really makes you think about how people understand religious texts and how their understanding shapes how they see the world,
Absolutely. All right, so we've got the second trump prophecy, the 2 trumpet sounds, the 5 raptures, and even a glimpse into this pastor's critiques of modern worship.
And we're just getting started.
There's so much more to explore in this sermon. It's really interesting, how he ties this critique of modern worship into his whole prophetic message. It's not just about the rapture happening way off in the future. It's about how folks are living their lives, like right now.
Right, exactly. And that's where his critique of what he calls service to humanity comes in. He seems to be pushing back against this idea that just helping other people, that's enough. He's saying true service to humanity has to be guided by God's instructions.
It's not enough to have good intentions? Is that what you're saying?
It sounds like he's saying that, yeah. You gotta be doing good in the right way for the right reasons, at least according to how he reads the Bible.
And for him, that leads right into his critique of how some churches are, doing things wrong in his eyes.
Yeah, this is where he gets really fired up about those ministers of worship,
Yeah.
the traveling musicians, charging for their services.
Something like that, huh?
Nope, he sees it as all about self-promotion and money, not real worship, not genuine praise.
And he even calls out pastors who are, going along with this trend.
Yeah, he suggests they've been tempted by, the whole spectacle of it all, the entertainment. It's a pretty harsh judgment.
It is. So what's the right way to worship then? According to this pastor, I mean.
He's all about worship that's focused only on God, happening in the house of God.
Keeping it traditional.
Exactly. He even goes so far as to say that this whole idea of a worship leader is wrong, fundamentally wrong. He actually says that the only one who ever held that role was Satan himself.
Whoa. That's a pretty strong statement.
Definitely bound to get people talking. And, it highlights just how divided folks can be, even within the same faith. When it comes to the Bible and how to live it out in the modern world, things can get pretty heated.
For sure. It's not just about theology. It's about culture, too.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's not afraid to bring current events into it all either. He even criticizes folks who are pushing for mask mandates back during COVID.
Really?
Yeah, he sees it as a form of control, even deception.
Hmm.
It's a good example of how his beliefs, his theological views, really shape his opinions on politics and society. It seems like he believes that pushing for masks and stuff, it was all part of some bigger agenda, one that goes against individual liberty and God's will.
So not just a critique of worship styles, then. It's bigger than that.
Way bigger. He sees it as this whole shift in society moving away from God, and he connects this directly to the tribulation that he believes is coming. It's like he's saying the folks who've bought into these worldly ways, whether it's through how they worship or whether they wear a mask, they're going to be left behind.
To face the music.
Yeah. It's a pretty intense message. Makes you wonder what he thinks happens to the folks who were taken up in those other raptures, the ones he doesn't talk about as much.
He doesn't give us a lot to go on, does he?
No, not really. He does imply that it might not be as, instant or as blissful as what happens to those who are part of the second flight. He hints that they might have to go through some tough times, some judgment, before they can be with God.
It's like there are different levels of, reward or punishment, depending on when you get raptured.
That seems to be his take, yeah. It's pretty different from how a lot of people think about the rapture. Makes you wonder what makes the difference,
Yeah.
What decides which rapture you're part of? Is it your actions, your beliefs? Just bad timing.
He's not super clear about that, is he?
Not exactly. But he stresses that it's crucial to be ready, to be living the kind of life that lines up with God's will. or at least his understanding of God's will.
And that means rejecting anything he sees as worldly, I guess.
Right, from pop culture to what's happening in some churches. It's a call to go back to a more, I don't know, old school kind of Christianity.
Yeah, more fundamentalist approach.
Yeah.
So he's not just preaching to the choir here, is he?
Not at all. He's challenging the way things are done. And he's offering what he sees as a better path. One, based on his reading of the Bible, one that leads to salvation.
Both challenging and comforting all at once. Depends on where you're coming from, I guess.
Absolutely. It really gets you thinking. Before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, where we'll get into the pastor's views on those other raptures and his prediction about the gospel reaching everyone this year, let's pause for a second. What stands out to you about his critique of modern worship and society?
What gets me is how he brings it all together, you know? Biblical prophecy, worship styles, even stuff like mask mandates. It all becomes part of this one big story that fits his view of the world.
It's a good reminder that what we believe shapes how we see everything around us. It's all connected.
Absolutely. All right, so we've covered the second trump prophecy, the 2 trumpets, the 5 raptures, and the pastor's take on modern worship and society. Coming up next, we'll explore what he has to say about those other raptures, the ones that come after the second flight, and what that might mean for those who are left behind. All right, so we've been unpacking this pastor's interpretation of the second Trump presidency as a sign of the rapture. We've talked about his critique of how churches do things these days, and even his take on what's going on in society as a whole. But he mentioned 3 other raptures, right? Besides the second flight. Does he give us any hints about what those might be like?
Well, he doesn't really spell it out. Keeps it kind of mysterious, you know.
Oh, a cliffhanger.
Yeah, a bit. But he does suggest that folks who are taken up in those later raptures, they might not experience the same thing as those in the second flight.
So not everyone gets the same rapture experience?
It seems like he's saying the timing matters a lot. The folks who were caught up in that second flight, the one tied to Trump's second term, they're the ones who get the full VIP treatment.
The best seats in the house.
Exactly. It's a fascinating take on the whole rapture idea. Makes you think about God's grace and judgment.
Right.
And how those things might play out in the end times.
Deep stuff. But in the middle of all this talk about raptures and tribulation, he drops his other big prediction. He says the gospel will be preached to every nation all over the world this year, 2025.
Yeah, that's a pretty bold statement.
He sees it as a final sign, right before the rapture happens.
Adds another layer to his whole prophetic timeline, doesn't it? A very specific time frame for all of this to go down.
It's interesting how he connects spreading the gospel with the rapture.
Yeah.
Like one causes the other, almost.
It seems like he believes that, yeah. Once that mission is accomplished, once the gospel has reached everyone, then the rapture can happen. Like God's waiting for that last piece to fall into place before he sets everything in motion.
Wow. That means what we do actually matters then. We're not just sitting around waiting.
Right. It's not just about a predetermined future. We have a role to play. Our choices matter.
And spreading the gospel is a big part of that, if you believe what this pastor is saying.
Yeah, he's not just predicting the future. He's encouraging people to go out and make it happen. A call to action, almost.
Well, this has been quite the deep dive. So much to think about.
We've explored a really unique view of the rapture, one that ties current events, political figures, and what's happening in society to a very specific way of interpreting the Bible. And we've just scratched the surface, really. There's always more to learn, more perspectives to consider.
Exactly. So as you listen to all of this, think about this. What role does prophecy play in your own life? How do you make sense of what's happening in the world, your faith, and how you understand things?
It's a question worth pondering.
It is. And that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us. Keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and keep the conversation going.
I hope you enjoyed that deep dive. I'm in the process of uploading the actual recording to my website, which you can see the address. So it will be there quite soon. I seriously hope that if you're listening to this, you are a Christian. Time is running out. You won't have the option. You do not want to be left behind. I will attach an end screen to this video so you can watch a video that I've made about the tribulation. You don't want to be on earth for that. You really don't.